Alberta's oil boom reconfigured that province's economy, drawing investment from around the world and workers from every corner of Canada. And if the bust didn't work exactly in reverse, it certainly sent reverberations far beyond the oil fields, particularly as the environmental arguments against the sector mounted. A new book captures the life in that hot and hotly contested sector. It's called The Patch: The People, Pipelines, and Politics of the Oil Sands, and we're pleased to welcome its author, Chris Turner, to our studio tonight. Chris, good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I must tell you, first of all, fascinating book, but I got to tell you, I didn't think a guy like you would write a book like this. You're a former Green Party candidate, right?
True story, yeah.
And yet you have said some things in this book that are actually even complimentary about the oil sands.
Right.
Why such a balanced approach?
Well, I think that was really, from the very beginning, that was the intention for this book. Was here is this topic, this industrial project, this piece of the significant slice of the Canadian economy, about which people have extraordinarily strong opinions, pro and con, but don't actually know all that much about. I mean, the backstory of it, how it came to be, who got it built, who's there, and who's making this thing happen, and how did it become such a lightning rod for controversy. That story hadn't been told, and so my intention really was to be as I guess you'd say empathetic as possible to the subject and to the people who were my sources on this story. I wanted to tell their story more than to make an argument, and I found as I went through that, their arguments had some merit to them. This is not a black and white issue. This is not a pro or con kind of thing. It's a very complex thing.
Well, that's interesting because we live in a world today where it is black or white. You are either with the environment or with the oil sands. You can't see nuance in anything. Did you find it a difficult task to try to tell a more nuanced story about a place that everybody's made their mind up about one way or the other?
Yeah, that's certainly a major challenge, even just in the research and the field reporting, to get people to think you're not hiding an agenda. And that was true on both sides. That was, industry people thought, this is going to be another hatchet job that makes us look like the worst thing in the world. And some of the most vocal opponents of the industry felt like surely I was, trying to trap them into something or other. So it was definitely, a very, very sensitive topic. People are looking for, are you with us or against us, that sort of thing. But I did find, the more time I spent talking to people, spending time in Fort McMurray and Fort Chipewyan and other communities connected to the oil sands, people did begin to really appreciate that there was some thought going into this, that they were actually being able to tell a bit of what they felt hadn't been told before about what they were doing.
But you had to spend the time there.
Absolutely.
How much time did you spend there in total?
All told, it was probably a couple months at 4 different stints. So.
And what, after those couple of months are over, would you say here in Upper Canada, our biggest misconception about Fort Mac would be?
I think, first of all, that it is an overgrown work camp for a dirty environmental project or dirty industrial project. It's a really interesting little city. I described this in the book. There's been this extraordinary experiment, urban experiment across Canada and all the big cities in diversity and welcoming new immigrants and that sort of thing. Fort McMurray did the same thing in 10 years of boom. So it is an incredibly diverse city. The people who've made their lives there really do feel like there is a sense of community and belonging there that is unique and powerful and keeps them coming. So it really isn't just this place where everyone's gone to make money.
Diverse geographically, to be sure. I mean, people from all over the country are there, but did you find also diverse ethnically, culturally, et cetera?
Absolutely, yeah. The sort of central symbolic event by which I try to explain just how diverse Fort McMurray is I was there at one point doing some reporting during Ramadan, and was talking to some folks who were involved in building the new mosque, because the old mosque in Fort McMurray could seat about 200 people for Friday prayers, and during Ramadan you would get 2,500 people. And so I went to basically a junior high school in suburban Fort McMurray to see people coming to gather for Friday prayers, and it really was just this extraordinary United Nations of parade of people from all over the world. Basically everywhere there are practicing Muslims, someone had their representative there. It was really quite a scene.
Here's an excerpt from the book. It is either Hiroshima or a wonder of the world, a vital economic engine or the most destructive project on earth, an essential commodity or dirty oil, Mordor or Fort McMoney. There is no nuance in this rhetoric, no room for compromise. If we wanted to have a more nuanced debate about the value of Fort Mac and all of the oil sands projects, what do you think that would look like in comparison to the debate we're kind of actually having.
Right. I think we would begin by acknowledging this is, if there is such a thing as a national project, this is a national project. This is a thing, the earliest federal government interest in Fort McMurray and the oil sands, it dates back to, almost the start of the 1900s. There were, governments at every level spent decades, tons of public research money, getting this to the point where it was profitable. Right up into the mid-1990s, there was this moment in 1995, Jean Chrétien, Ralph Klein, and a bunch of cabinet ministers all gathering for this declaration of opportunity because they'd changed, the tax and royalty regimes at both the federal and provincial levels to make this thing go. And at that moment, and that's not that long ago, when we really did kind of hit overdrive in the boom, this was something that was considered beneficial to all across Canada, was definitely a high priority on the national agenda, and we very much did kind of sink the whole country's fortunes into this. Well, and so suggesting that it's something over there that a bunch of people kind of went crazy for oil in northern Alberta, I think doesn't do it justice to its connection to the rest of the country.
I hear you. Speak to the argument though that, and I know that proponents of Fort Mac say in some respects it is this generation's national railway. It is a national economic project that affects all regions of the country. But obviously, a lot of people outside Alberta think it's all about Alberta and great for them, and they don't see the benefits beyond that, and that it's really not a national project. Make the counter-argument that it is.
Right. The railway is a good example. I mean, everyone understands the connection with the railroad. It goes right through their town.
Physical connection from province to province.
The connections are less obvious, but I mean, as we were saying, Fort McMurray has welcomed people from across the country. So you go to small towns in Nova Scotia, small towns in the interior BC, parts of southern Ontario where the economy has not been strong in recent years. That's the people who went to Fort McMurray to build this industry. On top of that, I mean, probably God knows what the percentage is. An extraordinarily large percentage of Canadians who have RRSPs are directly invested one way or another in the success of the oil sands. I don't think that negates the criticism, and I think that was one of the big mistakes of the last 10, 15 years, was saying this is good for the economy, so we don't want to hear about your problems with it. But I do think we have to acknowledge we're all dug in there.
How close to any of the major sites were you actually able to get?
So I actually got on one of them. I didn't have any sort of special journalistic access, but Suncor, which is the first of the big oil sands companies, built the very first mine, does offer public tours. So you do go on to site, you get to see, what the sort of processing area looks like. From a distance, you can see the huge trucks going in and out of the mine.
Do you feel you're getting the straight goods when you go on that tour?
No, it's obviously slanted to tell a certain story. They spend a lot more time in the very small part of the site where they've begun reclamation than they do anywhere where you can really get a good look at what the mine looks like and what a tailings pond looks like and that sort of thing. That said, it's not, it's too big and vast a thing to hide particularly. It is what it is. There's no one pretending tailings ponds are good for the environment. There's no one pretending there isn't a lot of natural gas burn to turn bitumen into usable oil. I think the industry's argument is, sure, we do that, but so does everyone else in the business. If our barrels are slightly more polluting than any other given barrel, really isn't the problem the 90-odd million barrels a day we're all burning, and not just the little bit that we're taking out of northern Alberta. Now, I think the industry's made some mistakes in the past. I think they could be doing a lot better, but they would certainly argue, we get that now, and we're on board.
Well, should we go to mistake number one?
Sure.
The duck.
The ducks.
Tell us the story about the ducks.
The story of the ducks, many people probably remember. 1,600 ducks landed on a tailings pond after a spring snowstorm in northern Alberta. Syncrude had failed to properly deploy deterrents. They have noise cannons and things like that to keep waterfowl off of those ponds. The ducks all died. The image went global overnight. The amazing thing was there was really, it was the one. It was a provincial government official took those pictures for documentary purposes, and then when the story started getting picked up, those were the file photos, and off they went. I think more than just the 1,600 ducks, which people have made the argument fairly is would be a good day for the ducks during hunting season. It was the symbolic power of that. I think that was a moment where the industry should have realized, even if it didn't, you are in a very different kind of conversation now about your necessity than you were before. People looked at that and thought, what are we doing in the name of, another couple million barrels of oil here?
Except that if you take that story in its global complexity, it's a nothing story. But the image, the industry just couldn't seem to figure out how to fight back against that image of those ducks desperately trying to sort of claw their way out of all that muck.
And stage by stage, as the duck story turned into a climate story, turned into a pipeline story, you saw the industry constantly trying to fight, probably an overly simplistic PR battle and never completely waking to the fact that they were never going to get ahead of the story until they could stand up and say, hey, here's what we're really doing to make tailings ponds, quicker to remediate, to reduce our carbon footprint. They are doing some of those things now, but by the time they caught up with what had happened in the image game, they were the worst environmental disaster on Earth. They were on posters and billboards across, around the world.
Except they really weren't. I mean, it wasn't the worst environmental disaster on Earth.
No.
But it got portrayed that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things when you talk to folks in the industry, they'll tell you, we didn't invent tailings ponds. Every mine on Earth, this is what it looks like. But they were the poster child. So once you're on the poster, getting back off of it, that's a tall order.
We have had, for many, many years in this country, a great debate about whether or not the Keystone XL pipeline is something that is desperately needed or just something that ought to be avoided at all costs. And to get into that discussion, let's play a clip. Sheldon, let's bring this up here. Here's the mayor of Calgary discussing Keystone XL on CNBC a couple of years ago. Roll it, please.
One of the challenges with Keystone is, for some reason, that 1 meter wide pipe has been asked to bear all the sins of the carbon economy. And it really isn't. It's not, not having Keystone isn't going to end the carbon necessity, or it's not going to change climate change. But somehow that one pipeline is bearing all of this.
Well, it has a symbolic nature.
It's deeply symbolic, which is a shame.
Now, Hiddenshi on the Keystone XL, how did that pipeline, would-be pipeline, get to be such a touchstone for everybody?
Right. Well, I mean, the story does begin with incidents like the duck incident, and the oil sands industry not recognizing that this wasn't just going to go away. That this was, it had a long-term image problem. But really the major piece of that began with the failure, actually, of the international climate talks in Copenhagen in 2009. There was Barack Obama was the president. American environmentalists and environmental groups particularly thought we're finally going to be doing something serious on climate change. Instead, those talks broke down. Obama's cap and trade bill collapsed in Congress around the same time. And so there was this sense of almost desperation among climate leadership in the United States. What do we need something? We need a campaign. We need to rally people. We have no sense of momentum or purpose right now as a movement. And Keystone was a very, very convenient target. It's most of the companies involved in the profit is all outside of the United States. It's a single thing that the president could approve or disapprove it with a pen,
which he did, the latter.
And it had natural allies. You had conservative ranchers who didn't like it, and you had First Nations who didn't like it, and so it was a really powerful sort of focus for a lot of protest energy that had nowhere else to go.
What role do you think Prime Minister Stephen Harper played in all of this? He was obviously a huge booster of it. He's an Alberta-based MP. What role did he play in the drama surrounding all of this?
Well, he saw fire and threw gasoline on it, basically, is the role he played. I think you could not have done a worse job of reassuring people of Canada's responsibility environmentally, its intent to meet climate targets than Stephen Harper did. Basically, took a very simplistic approach. You want our oil, you need it. That was a lot of the message to the United States.
He thought it was a no-brainer.
A no-brainer, exactly. And I think just completely misunderstood the nature of the debate that was emerging around Keystone and around the oil sands, and really couldn't have done a better job of playing the villain that protest movement needed to give it further momentum.
I mean, Canadian-U.S. relations are obviously extremely complicated and multifaceted, but that was a major irritant between Stephen Harper and Barack Obama. How much of a negative consequence do you think that decision alone played in relations between our two countries?
I mean, it certainly was a factor. They didn't particularly seem to like each other, and this was a major policy goal of Stephen Harper's government that was getting nowhere and actually, sort of backtracking under Obama. Not to be discounted, though, was that Obama, after 2009, had some leverage of his own that didn't get talked about as much, which is all of a sudden the United States was a major oil producer again. The fracking boom completely changed the game. It made the necessity argument that Harper's government was backing. You need our oil. This is a vital source. Well, I mean, they were bringing, the oil sands is 2.5 million barrels. During the 5 years we were debating Keystone XL, the U.S. introduced 4 or 5 million barrels of fracked oil. So not only was Harper not a very good ally as far as Obama was concerned, he didn't need the project anymore.
Let's do another excerpt from the book. When the patch's boosters say they are simply supplying a product everyone uses every single day, they are not wrong. When the Prime Minister says no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there, he's not wrong. When anti-pipeline protesters say some of that oil has to stay in the ground, they're not wrong. When Indigenous people say they've never been properly consulted about what those pipelines and bitumen mines are doing to their land, they're not wrong. How do you come to some kind of consensus and or resolution when everybody's got a little bit of truth and a little bit of bad PR on their side?
Right. I think you do so with great difficulty. Yeah. And I think certainly that's, Prime Minister Trudeau finds himself in a position where there is no answer that's going to completely please everyone and lots of answers that aren't going to please anyone. And it's a very difficult situation. I think it gets at the fact, that this debate over climate change and energy use, this is going to be a defining debate of our time for years, decades to come. And sorting out things like pipelines and bitumen and, Indigenous rights around those and environmental responsibility around those, there's no simple solution anywhere along the way. And I don't think it helped that we began this debate with such acrimony and such, active polarization and divisiveness, particularly on the part of, Stephen Harper and some of his allies in industry out of the gate. I think everyone's kind of coming back around to the idea, hey, we better figure out a way to build a slightly larger tent for this project, but it took a while to get there.
What do you think about the possibility of getting to, I don't know if it's a pipe dream or they're close or what, zero emissions in trying to get this stuff out of the ground? Is that an option?
I think the option certainly is to do much less damage climate-wise to get a barrel of bitumen to market. An enormous amount of the new production in the oil sands is in situ, so fairly deep in the ground. They use a ton of steam to basically liquefy it and push it out of these deep deposits. And at present, that means burning a lot of natural gas. And that's where a lot of this, bigger carbon footprint comes. The companies heavily involved in SAGD, companies like Cenovus, are putting a lot of time and money and technological development effort into moving away from natural gas to other ways of getting the in situ bitumen out of the ground. They're not there yet, but they look at that and say, give us a few more years and we will eventually have a barrel that's at least no bigger in carbon footprint than any other given barrel. And then they start looking past that and saying, hey, maybe we can start to figure out ways to make, further downstream to eliminate or reduce emissions at the tailpipe, to create products that are useful out of carbon dioxide rather than just blowing it into the atmosphere. And then they start to say, hey, we could really get to zero emissions. Now, I think that's a far further off goal, and there's a lot of proof of concept needs to happen before we buy into that. But shrinking the footprint to a size where there's no really strong climate case to be made against bitumen versus any other barrel of oil, I think that's a reasonable midterm goal. Okay.
Chris, let's finish up on this. You know where you were in your own head when this project started, and now you've written the book, The Patch. What have you changed your mind about in relation to all of this?
Well, probably the biggest thing, not to keep harping on it, is that it's a much more complex thing, and there is no really simple answer. I think I certainly, spending a lot of the last 10 years looking at clean energy solutions and building that low carbon economy, I thought, that new way of doing things is near enough that the last thing we should be doing is pumping millions of barrels of oil out of this marginal resource in northern Alberta. The logic of how it came to be and why it still is a pretty important piece of a global energy system for the foreseeable future. I think I get that now. I think it's problematic. I can understand, particularly if you live in a community downstream like Fort Chipewyan, where you feel like you're looking down the barrel of extraordinary destruction. Yep. I can understand where that kind of opposition comes from. But if we're talking about how do we get to the sort of next level of our response to climate change, I don't think that we begin that by shutting down the oil sands.
The name of the book is The Patch, with its alliterative subtitle, The People, Pipelines, and Politics of the Oil Sands. Chris Turner, great to have you in at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.